Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Belden Menkus. Now, if you listen to yesterday's show, we played an episode of Belden's new podcast, The Purposeful Strategist. And if you didn't listen to that episode, definitely check it out. Today, we're going to have a longer discussion with Belden himself. Belden, welcome to the show.
Will, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Welcome back, I should say. So Belden, yesterday we kind of teed up this idea of purpose, and one thing that, when we were talking offline that I thought was pretty cool was a couple equations that you shared, which is one was situation plus identity equals purpose. I'll say that again, situation plus identity equals purpose. And the other one was clarity plus alignment equals action. Clarity plus alignment equals action. I think those are pretty cool equations. Tell me a little bit about how did you come up with those?
I suppose like most of what I use with my clients, it's a bit of experience and seeing what works, and it's a bit of stealing from others. I don't think either of those from anybody else, but the first one really came from my experience, goes back quite a ways, but when I was at McKinsey. And I was at McKinsey about 6.5 years, and in retrospect realized that I had a very unusual time. About half of it was doing fairly, I'll say, traditional McKinsey-esque strategy work of its time. You'd go out, you'd gather data, you'd do analysis, you'd come back to the client with a big document and tell them, this is what XYZ company should do. And the other half of my time there, I was often working on my own with an entirely client team. And we didn't approach it that way for understandable reasons. That wasn't their skill set. That wasn't the things they were interested in. But I did notice that, often what they were trying to do is not necessarily get the facts of what was going on, but to make sense of it. What I've described as a situation. And so both there and then following developed a set of tools and approaches for allowing groups of people to come together and create representations, maps of the situation they're in. And then I noticed that the energy in the whole conversation would change when the conversation moved beyond the kind of head level of what are the facts into discussion about what kind of people are we? What do we want? The pronouns stopped being they or the company and started being me and us. And the verbs shifted to much more ones about desire or what we would and wouldn't do, what I call identity. And then that all led to a much clearer statement of what are we trying to, not necessarily what must we do, what ought we to do, but what are we committed to doing, sort of in response to the situation we find ourselves in. And the clarity plus alignment equals action one somewhat came out of a similar process in that pretty obvious, I guess, but a strategy with no action, you might as well not have it. And so what I noticed, I did then and still do a lot of work facilitating workshops. And so I just noticed that the two things were, can we get clear as a shared group on what we think is true? And then can we get aligned around it? It's not just sort of a sitting out there, yes, I can agree, but some sense of being in it together. And that then would lead to, so here's what we do about it. Usually a much longer list of what we ought to do about it than the organization had capability for. So often then it was almost working a process of saying, so this is what we're not going to do.
Right. Now, I know that you certainly work with for-profit entities and work with them on, this aspect of purpose and strategy. I was interested to chat with you with some of the work that you've done for kind of bodies that are not necessarily charities, but that are, not for-profit entities. And one of them was the one from your podcast episode that we played yesterday, was for the Port of London. Could you talk a little bit about, the maybe any kind of special considerations when you're working with that kind of entity on its strategy and defining its purpose?
Sure. A couple of things. One or two bits of it maybe are specific to the Port of London Authority, but often organizations like that have some founding definition of what their purpose is. So the Port of London Authority was a body that was created in the early 1900s. So obviously much later than when the port itself was founded, because it's been around for hundreds of years. But at the time, there was a feeling that the port needed some overarching body that could regulate and improve the port. And so it was created as a matter of legislation, a statutory body, as it's called here, with a very clearly spelled out purpose. Now, often for-profit businesses have an equivalent, articles of association or something like that. But usually the thing that's in there is a fairly straightforward definition, one way or another, that what we're really here to do is to make money, to earn a return for our shareholders. Now, of course, there's lots of pressures on organizations now to broaden that out. But there are a set of bodies that often have had to wrestle with this issue of we don't have one singular thing. We have a number of aims and objectives. So for the Port of London Authority, one of theirs is to maintain navigational safety in the port. So they're kind of like the air traffic control people for the port. A different objective they have is to improve the usage and grow the volume moving through the port. Well, the more volume you have, the more dangerous it is. So they're used to having to make these strategic level trade-offs between different objectives. And I think one of the things that many for-profit businesses are going to find is that they're increasingly having to do that. Not just as and then we've got to do a little CSR or a little ESG stuff on the side, but actually much more fundamentally in terms of what is this organization here for?
Yeah, because there's no single objective function that you can measure it by. So tell me about how you've worked with organizations to get them to that clarity of purpose.
So with PLA, I started working with them. It was a number of years ago. I think it was maybe four or 5 years ago. They had started some work on creating what they call the vision for the tidal Thames. So that's the river sort of from fairly far out at sea, certainly much further out at sea than I think I'd want to go, all the way up to where it stops being tidal. So it's about 95 miles end to end. And it has multiple users. It has lots of different types of traffic. They were doing some work to pull that together. But what they didn't have necessarily was a strategy for themselves as an organization. So I came in and worked with them on that. And pulled together, and this is often a way I tend to work with people, pulled together a group that's sort of a cross-section of the organization, and then through a series of workshops began to help them map out what was going on around them. One of the exercises I often do is a bit of a corporate history. So to create a timeline on the wall and have people, you sort of organize people by when they join the organization, and whoever's been there the longest starts to tell the story. And while they're doing it, they sort of put it on a long sheet of brown paper. And then they get to the next person who joined. And so by the time they take over telling the story, by the time you get to the end of it, you've created this sense for the organization of not only who are we now, but who have we been in the past? Working with a different client, it was very interesting when I started getting to know them and interviewing some of the execs. One of the things they all said is, we're just not very innovative. All the things that are happening nowadays in our part of the world, in our sector, other people are doing. We did this corporate history, and you could see through it. There were a number of times that they had created new innovations that totally changed globally the nature of their organization, of their sector. And so they started reimagining who they were. They were like, well, we used to be innovative, and there's actually a lot of people who were there then are still here now. We just kind of lost our mojo somewhere. And so starting to redefine who they were. And that same process of let's figure out not just we've got this kind of literal level definition of who we are, but the like who could we be on our best day is often, for me anyway, a key part of this work of figuring out. So then what's our purpose? If we're an innovative organization, an organization in a sector that's pretty traditional, what role do we want to play in that? And that then led to them deciding to take a very different, much more proactive role about a number of things.
What are some of the questions that you ask, or when you are, interviewing executives to get at that sense of purpose and help to uncover that?
Sometimes it's nothing terribly sophisticated. Well, sometimes it's just literally asking people, kind of like, what do you guys think you're here for? But often, I, I, I won't necessarily kind of take that and then feed it back. What I'm trying to do usually is create a sort of a thought path for a group of people to go through that along the way they'll discover it for themselves. And that's usually kind of custom tailored for the organization based on who they are and where they are and what they've got already in terms of artifacts. Sometimes they've got some definition of purpose, but you kind of realize this is all pretty hollow. So it's usually, like I say, it's a custom tailored journey to take a group of people. Sometimes it's the board, sometimes it's a cross section of sort of one or two levels down in the organization, leaders, to sort of go on that experience and discover it for themselves.
Do you sometimes find that people will, say something that, on the surface they say is the purpose, but if you probe on it a bit, the organization, it's just kind of paying lip service to that idea because, they're not actually, pursuing that ideal?
Yeah, I mean, of course you do. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. And most times I don't think it's intentional, actually. People get distracted. But the questions around money and are we making money are often very here and now. And the questions about, shaping the environment that we're in, or, how do we move our business to contribute to the net zero carbon agenda, things like that usually take longer. So it's true, I think, of everybody, the urgent often pushes out the important.
Yeah.
And habit, as I'm sure we all know, habit is a huge factor. Organizations develop all sorts of habits and often don't, when they set a new direction, a new purpose, a new thing we're trying to do, don't then go, okay, so what habits do you have to change? So, most organizations have some sort of reporting cycle. Often that's heavily financial, very light on the things that would tell you, are we moving towards the sort of purpose that we say we're pursuing? And yet, unless you are willing to go back and kind of try and reimagine a bunch of those, those reporting cycles are just part of an ingrained muscle memory that leads the organization to pay attention to certain things and not to others.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you want to work with people on purpose, one of the key things is, back to kind of what you were saying, if you find a mismatch, is to again draw people to almost a question that says, so how does this bit of organizational activity, behavior, whether it's your reporting cycle or your incentives, or help me understand how that supports your purpose. And often then people, if it does, sometimes it's like, in a way I hadn't understood it does. But equally, sometimes people begin to say, oh yeah, you're right, that's not actually helping us.
Can you share some examples? And I mean, you can either, say what the company is, or you keep it sanitized, of the end of this journey of, a kind of a purpose statement that a company has landed on, that resonated with them, that they were aligned around. Can you give me an examples to make it tangible for me?
Yeah, I can. If you don't mind, I'll use the PLA, the Port of London Authority, and this should all be on the website. They at the end of the work with them so the first wave of work I did with them, they came up with this phrase, the custodians of the tidal Thames. And that could sound pretty anodyne, and at one level it is. Uh, but sitting underneath that, they then said, okay, great, that's our purpose. The strategy, again, summed up very simply, was we're going to protect. So that was both protect from a kind of navigational standpoint, safety standpoint, but also in terms of the environmental aspect of it. We're going to improve. And one of the key things that came out of this work was a decision that they made that they were going to invest in buying property. And that may seem a kind of not terribly interesting decision, but the Port of London Authority, just to kind of cover the history of it a bit, they used to operate the docks. They don't anymore. Throughout the time period, they sold almost all of that off. And yet they realized that there were certain spots along the river that if they didn't own them over the next 20 or 30 years, the port's ability to carry materials into the center of London and then find a way to get them off the river would go away. And so they began a process, and of course, it's going to take them years, but of investing in buying certain bits of land near the actual water, near the river, so they can begin then to promote using what they call inland freight, using that as an incredibly low carbon way to move heavy materials into the center of London. So construction materials and things like that. So that was improve. And then the third bit was promote. So in some ways they were all just kind of, you could almost see them as slogans. But once you began to peel down underneath it, then you got, you said, okay, so how are we going to do this? There were sort of layers of the actions they were actually going to take and the metrics they were going to look at to make it all happen.
What sort of impact can it have on an organization once they reach this kind of clarity of purpose, either on recruiting or retention or performance?
Let me just talk about two aspects of that. One is kind of how do people feel about it, and I know I'm not going to say anything on this that anybody who looks at anything about purpose in organizations wouldn't know, but it really does give people a sense of alignment between who they are and what they do at work, which I think just at a human level makes a difference to people. There's an awful lot of people who work for the PLA that are their communities almost are oriented towards the river. It's the maritime life is part of who they are. And being part of an organization that's protecting and improving and promoting that, I think can make a difference at that level. But I think it also often allows organizations to be more collaborative internally, but also externally. If you're all about profit, I think it sometimes can be very difficult to genuinely collaborate with other organizations. You can deals with them, you can pay them or they can pay you, you can set up a joint venture, but collaboration's a much looser concept. And if you have a purpose that you can reach out to other people and say, look, this is what we're trying to do, where can we work together on it? It changes that. But you also get that same effect often internally. And with that, I'm not saying this was true of the Port of London Authority, but often organizations can be very siloed. And having some overarching purpose help kind of cut through those silos can pull together people. One of the things I do is I run a series of roundtables. More recently, they've been virtual. The last one I did, a guest was saying that in her organization, they've been a lot clearer about their purpose. So it's a Basically, they help people who need to do marketing production. So that whether that's filming things or putting stuff on print or whatever. And they were saying, look, our job is to help our clients make that entire process less carbon intensive, which I thought was very interesting because I wouldn't have imagined that net zero would have been a big part of that. She said, no, that's what we're doing. First of all, it distinguishes us from others in our space because a lot of people aren't talking about that. But also, it turns our organization from being very vertical to being horizontal. Because often to make the carbon savings work, we're trading off air miles versus sending a production crew on site somewhere around the world. So where you book the savings and where you make the decisions are at the same place. So you have to look at the organization to make it work. And I think that sense of vertical to horizontal, driven by a higher purpose, I think is a big factor in a lot of organizations. Will, did I answer your question or did I just ramble?
No, that was great.
Good.
What suggestions would you have for consultants listening to this episode who are interested in doing more of this type of work with their clients, of helping their clients find not just a strategy, but really a purpose to help crystallize that strategy?
Yeah. I think there's two places I might suggest people look. And the first is to look kind of within, ask themselves, why am I trying to do this? Am I doing this because I know it's a wave, it's a topic, I can surf the wave, it's something that if I talk to people, they'll listen. Or am I doing this because I really genuinely believe that organizations that embrace some sense of a higher or broader purpose are better, and I want to help my clients get better. So this is part of what I'm going to do. I think that's the first thing. The second is I've just mentioned an organization that I didn't come across until I started doing my own podcast, which is here in the UK, but much of their material is available online. It's called A Blueprint for Better Business. One of the interviews I've done is with their chief executive, Charles Wookey. And they have a lot of material that talk about how they're a charity, they're a very small charity, about how they work with organizations. There's a lot of tools that are available there. If somebody's serious about this and they want to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to spend, a bit of time with anybody, unless I get so overwhelmed, and then we'll turn it into some kind of online seminar. But happy to have a chat to anybody who wants to seriously explore, how can they take this forward.
Fantastic. Well, Belden, for people that do want to follow up with you or learn more about your work, where would you point them online?
It's menkus.com, www.menkus.com.
Okay, we'll include that link in the show notes here. So Belden Menkus, thank you so much for joining today. And listeners, do check out Belden's podcast, The Purposeful Strategist. Belden, thanks for joining.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.